questions, but would I be right in thinking, do you think? Well, one of the models that investors are asking of small companies when they make a significant discovery is, why don't you just sell it to somebody who's bigger? And that implies that bigger companies are going to do this better because they have more resources, they've got more know-how, they've got more experience, they've got more people. And when you get to a certain scale, and maybe the Exxon scale as we were talking about, unless they're driven by something like David was talking about, which is we need to be the first ones in the basin to develop a project, develop a discovery, actually they're not strategic to them. Because, you know, if Exxon's block 17 involvement in Angola was delayed by 6 months, maybe so what? You know, it's not strategic, it's not important, big company, we can survive that. So my question is bigger better in this context? Does this work well for bigger companies, and smaller companies should indeed avoid developing discoveries like the plague? So I don't know whether either of you, any of the three of you want to pick that up? Mike, why don't you start?
I think it depends upon what the drivers and ambitions of the smaller company are. But I mean, you inherently, yes, you would suggest that that probably is the best thing to do. Either significantly sell it on completely, or certainly bring in another big player who has the capability, robustness, and also the financial robustness to help along the smaller player. So, you know, it's and I can think of examples, and I'm sure you know examples very close to home, that you know, you would think, gosh, if they'd only brought in so and so, it would have significantly helped them. But that doesn't say that the bigger companies are any better or will be any better. It's just that they have the size and the muscle and the financial robustness potentially to kind of be able to, as you say, survive those and stuff like that. So that would be my bias, yes. So if you make a big discovery in somewhere deep water, West Africa, either bring in a big player to take a big chunk of it and maybe take over operatorship, and you just reap in the benefits, or you just sell it off and get the benefits up front. But that would be my inherent bias, unless there's a very, very good reason for you to take it on yourself. And that might be about you and your willingness to become a big player and ambitions to become a big player. But you make those decisions in a very, very considered way, and I wonder whether some people do.
Okay. Mark, do you got that?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with Mike, is that, you know, the big companies have these processes that protect them from the failures, but I would say that I think if a small company could avoid the irrational exuberance, which you talked about earlier, and you know, and I think the advantage a small company have is that it can probably focus on the critical aspects of a project and might be able to pursue it in a more effective way. So the big company wants to do A to Z in terms of its processes, which will lead to a certain amount of inertia, and some of these processes are actually not adding any value to that particular project. So I think the big companies will probably do better on average, but I think a small company that was really focused and disciplined could actually do better than a big company on occasions.
And the other word is capable. It's capability.
Yeah.
Well, and I would agree with the capability issue, because we see independents who we as a group think can go faster than some of the majors, but some of them are better than others. You can see it in their performance. Some of them, I mean, wisdom is knowing what you do well, and there are some that quite strategically say, this is our sweet spot is developing smallish floaters at 200 to 300 million barrels, and it's bigger than that. We're just not going to develop this one. So I mean, there's some, but of course some of them have the luxury of having an exploration group that's finding them lots of opportunities, and that lets them apply that wisdom.
I mean, there was a phase in the 90s where Kerr-McGee had.
That's what I had in mind.
Yeah, Kerr-McGee were able to deliver exploration opportunities that needed spar technology. Yeah. They had a project group that made a spar, then it made another spar, then it made another spar, and they really got to be quite good at doing it.
They kind of matched the reservoir to keep looking like it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And I guess sorry, I'm going to give other people a chance to ask a question, but when you sit on a board, how should you respond to all this? I mean, what, because, if you look at a big development, let's say somewhere offshore West Africa, just as an example, I mean, probably the amount of time a board gets to spend looking at it in terms of here we are, we've made the discovery, here we are, it's now appraised, here we are, we're now at the, going through the define and select. If you add all that up, it'll be a working day, sort of 8 hours probably. I mean, how the hell does a board get on top of that sort of thing, do you think?
I think one way you can do it is, in addition to having some of the best explorers on board, you make sure you have some of the best developers on the board to help you through things like that. Now, I don't know whether that's the case or not, in the ones that but I mean, it's having that, particularly on the non-executive side, the people who are going to give you the brutal truth, and make sure you choose the people who give you the brutal truth, not who are going to go and give you the kind of platitudes, oh, you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. And that's the kind of thing you have. Now, I don't know whether that's the case in the example that you have to mind, Dave, or not.
Well,
but
it was a kind of how do you resist an over-exuberant CEO, I suppose, which you never had a British Gas, of course. I mean, but do you think that expertise is actually out there? People who
I think so. Yeah, I think
can say, hang on a minute,
Absolutely. And I can think of one particular one that comes to my mind of a development that's kind of moving ahead, where it was a relatively smaller company. It was a big, because of the scale of it, it was quite strategic for them in that sense. And their leadership, not at the very top of the company, had delusions of capability, and they believed they could move major projects through. But the very top of the company recognised there were potential risks there and brought in 2 or 3 of those people who spent a lot of time with the individual with delusions and the rest of the teams to make sure that the pace was set right, it was defined in the right kind of way, and most importantly, playing into both of us, there's the uncertainty was clearly characterised and the risks that created were characterised. And I think that worked well. But, and that's where this exodus of capability from the industry can be brought to most effect, I think, as well.
Yeah, and Rolando or Mark, anything to add to that?
I would add to that. I mean, that's a great example of constructive insight from that executive. And I'm also skeptical of very large formal systems in terms of the inertia that they sometimes bring. But something that the executive really adds the value, as I want to reinforce, is when that executive says, I want certain metrics to be the same for everything that comes before me. So that I can, because I'm not going to be able to understand all the details of this project, but I want to be able to know that the same criteria were applied to everything that comes before me.
Okay. And Mark, you were making a point, I think, of saying deep water fields have this special property that you can't intervene easily. In fact, if you've got
a generalised sense.
Yeah, but if you've got 50 wells out there, it's actually difficult to tell which one's the one producing sand and do something about it. So both bits. Difficult to tell which one, and then difficult to intervene. Yeah.
Unless you bring it in, it's all that greenfield brownfield thing. So if you bring the need for reservoir management into the greenfield phase, then you have an opportunity to design for it. If you've missed the boat, then it's gone basically.
Yeah, which is different from Brent or Forties or
yes.
It's subsea more than anything else.
It's a subsea issue, isn't it?
It's subsea.
Yeah.
If you're in subsea, your chances of intervening are going to be limited, and you can build it into your plan at the start. But my goodness, when that well's producing, the chances of stopping it and then bringing in, whatever is $1,000, $100,000, $1 million a day rig into there to intervene, are slim to anorexic.
You can mitigate it, but you certainly can't make it disappear.
So we, in BP, we always used to drive at least a minimum of 5% discounted recovery factor and discount the production profile, just driven by subsea.
I think there's a nice paper by Statoil where they benchmarked subsea and platform and came to some similar sort of metrics that you And of course, when you build a reservoir model, when you build an Eclipse model, well, Eclipse doesn't really know that it's subsea.
No,
That's right.
So, you'll spit the same numbers out unless you think about it in an insightful
it's like
way.
it's capability, it's having the experience and expertise to put in that knowledge that will give you a reasonable outcome that's not, conditioned by your exuberance.
Okay, so enough of me asking questions. Does anybody else? Yeah, please. Terry, over here.
Where are we?
Um,
Hands up.
yeah, standing up.
There he is.
No.
Thank you. They just said about our industry that we tend to overpromise and underdeliver. And yet we say that our industry is a conservative industry. How come these two things to go together? A conservative industry delivering false promises. I think we need to unravel this, where we are conservative and where we tend to be somewhat slipshod. So, unravel this and try and identify what we can do to be less conservative in the areas that we want it to be less conservative, and to be more accurate in the areas where the accuracy is limited. Thank you.
Okay, so there is an allegation about our industry that we're incredibly conservative in applying new technologies. No? And McKinsey and Shell did a study 5-10 years ago which demonstrated that in almost any technology application you can think of, the oil and gas industry takes twice as long as the pharmaceutical industry or iron and steel industries or any other industry you care to name. So on the one hand, we've got a reputation for, I'm not going to try this new technology on my patch. I'll be a fast follower or even a medium-paced follower. And on the other hand, as the gentleman says, you've got this external reputation for overpromising and under. So how do those things fit together, do you think? Do they fit together? Or are we just...
I don't personally subscribe to the sort of perception that the industry is slow in applying technology. I think that myth is created by technology providers who have failed to understand that their technology doesn't actually apply to everything. So I have an idea, I have a solution, but I haven't yet quite worked out whether you have the problem or not. So I think when you come to critical technologies, actually the oil and gas industry is pretty aggressive and applies them. And the other issue is that, the learning cycles, we're in a business where I make a decision and do something, and then I often figure out whether it worked or not 5 and 10 years later. So, you're going to be inherently a bit more conservative in a cycle like that, where you can't, if I try a drug tomorrow and the guy is better 6 weeks later, I'm in an industry where I can, or an operational environment where I'm making things, let's try something tomorrow. Oh, we made 5 times as much stuff the day after. So the learning cycles are very short in some industries, which allows them
that's a good point.
to create the impression of moving quickly. So I don't buy it. I've seen a lot of technologies from people who complain about them not getting applied, and you look at them and you say, yeah, well, the problem is it doesn't apply to my problem. I haven't got your,
Yeah. Anybody else?
I agree. I think I would say maybe more than 10 years ago, we saw a divergence in use of new technology in downstream and upstream industries, but I wouldn't say that's the case anymore. And I certainly wouldn't say when we look at the practices that it's a conservative industry. I don't think it is a conservative industry in how it goes forwards with its business decisions.
I think it depends. I always think of technology in 2 dimensions. It's either enabling or enhancing. If you're in a place where you've got something, you've made a discovery, and that it is only going to be converted into value by enabling technology, by something new, you'll do it. And the industry's got an enormously great track record of doing that. But actually, where it's something as enhancing, you've really got to bring it in early on in the project description, the front-end loading. Or else those very robust and pretty hard-nosed project managers who are delivering this thing through the latter stages, they're not going to bring anything new in. And too often we don't bring that in early enough. We don't bring the new technology in almost literally at the point of, resource appraisal, the very, very front end of the appraisal phase of the project. And once you realise the timeliness of the introduction, it's important. So once you get up beyond there, you do become inherently conservative because you haven't got much scope to be anything other than conservative. And I don't necessarily think the conservatism, the technology thing, is anywhere linked to the pace issues and things. I think that they're rather different.
They're separate things. Yeah. It's interesting because I took an interest in this pace of technology, and one of the well-known sayings is, if you build a better mousetrap, the world will beat a path to your door. And somebody said to me a year or so ago that they forgot that one of the responses to that was, actually, we don't have mice here,
Yes.
we have squirrels. And that's the kind of what Mark was getting at, that a lot of people who complain about uptake are actually people bringing solutions for which there is no problem. And actually, when you sit inside EMP, you have lots of problems and are looking for solutions, and that's a different...
I think there's another element to that, Dave, which plays in, which is very often those solutions are clear and apparent but poorly communicated. So they're clear and apparent in a timely manner. When you access a Playfair way to explore it, you'll recognise, gosh, this is going to be the challenge for developing this. But we don't adequately convey that challenge externally. And so that the time we need the new technology is almost too late.
Yeah.
And so I think there's a piece of understanding the implications of entering this basin, entering this kind of Playfair way, whatever it is, from an exploration perspective. What does that mean from a development perspective? And then how can I spike the external world to create that technology ready for me?
Yeah. Okay, anybody else? Yeah, please, Jim. Yeah, just wait for the mic, Jim.
Okay.
There you go.
I'm afraid I missed a couple of the earlier talks, but I was noticed very much that your field size is well dependent, well performance dependent. I totally agree with that. But did anybody manage to convert all this to a minimum field size as a function of water depth, and price, of course?
Commercial size, you mean?
Yeah, developable.
I mean, certainly I have experience of that. It's very dependent on the terms. So I'd say it was almost impossible to generalise, but, people are not doing, people are not exploring for 50 and 100 million barrels in new provinces, are they? They when you take the exploration risk in, and if there isn't existing legacy infrastructure, people seem to be looking for, it's always 250 million barrels. This is in the middle of nowhere. I'm talking about now, not not in the North Sea, or but it's a bit hard to generalise. But certainly I've seen those sorts.
Interesting attempt to do that.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting kind of follow on from that. Your words about new province. So is the basin entry? Yeah, absolutely. These little ones won't work. But it never ceases to astonish me. I watch what's going on in the kind of Miocene subsalt of the Gulf of Mexico. 10 or 12 years ago, my goodness, you never have thought people are targeting $50 to $100 million fields and making money out of them. So it depends upon the maturity of the field and the maturity of the province that you're working in that sense. And it rapidly matures because people become very aggressive followers. It's the people who step out into the first place, into the new bits of West Africa and things, that have the big challenge.
I might lightheartedly say that's because in the Gulf of Mexico, of course, there's a lot of infrastructure to
Mhm.
tie into, but additionally,
Absolutely.
there are a lot of host platforms that have disappointed and have
Yeah,
others.
no, exactly. All of those things.
And the fiscal
Absolutely.
regime
That's
is
right.
quite,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
the fiscal regime in the Gulf is
Yeah.
pretty attractive
Yeah.
as well.
So, but it does surprise me, to watch what people are exploring for now in the Gulf.
Please, over there.
Tom Martin, Island GIS. I'm afraid I'm one of those companies with solutions in search of problems. Something that someone mentioned earlier that I'd be very interested to take your thought on. It was a point about experience being essential to do the job properly, that you needed time to take the experience. If, as you're also implying, the life cycle of the project that you're looking at to get the empirical proof, if you have to wait a long time till you've got the experience to make the decision, and then you're not going to be around to face the consequences, but perhaps to take the profit beforehand, isn't that creating a sort of an inherited, disjointed cause and consequence effect against within the senior management, the key decision makers?
Yes.
The other follow up then is that it was actually very good to see that to see Tversky and Kahneman being discussed in Herily. But I would say it's with copies of the book going for about 200, 300 quid. I don't think it's probably going to be a book that's on everyone's shelf.
But it is interesting you're saying. I mean, having worked with Exxon as partners and things like that, Exxon do carry that responsibility through. So, you move away from your area, it still hangs around you until it's demonstrably working. And then the other thing, I thought the question you were going to ask is, given the time cycle of these projects, most people in their careers aren't going to get through more than 2 or 3. How do you create experience? And that is not trivial. And that's about great learning, great capability organisations. And I don't think yet all of the industry, and certainly the smaller and medium-sized companies, have certainly quite embraced that side of it. So, because that is a big challenge that most of us in our careers, in that 30-year career, probably won't have gone through more than 2 or 3 of these. So how do you soak up all the knowledge that's gone on, not just in your company, but more broadly?
It leads to another one with something on a project 2 years ago. How do you persuade the experienced senior member of the project to pass on his knowledge that kept him in work?
Well, I mean, there are certain people who retire from BP and go and live in Yorkshire and become professors at Manchester University. One way.
Well, I've always had it personally. I mean, Dave knows I passionately believe in learning and doing everything you can to help and coach people. But it's down to people's personality. I don't think you can incentivize it. I can think of an individual who's currently in BP, retired a number of years ago, who to me is a big risk because he actually owns all of the field database for BP and nobody else can get at it. Right. But because he owns it and has run it for so many years, it's become his own pride and joy. This guy is no spring chicken anymore.
If I could just make two comments. I mean, at a personal level, I have always tried really hard to stay in touch with assets and projects I've worked on. So Magnus got mentioned earlier. Well, 25 years ago, I sat in a little office in Dice and ran the Magnus simulation model for a bit. And I know what the reserves are roughly today on Magnus, and I know they're absolutely nothing like what I predicted 25 years ago. So my offer to you would be to, I don't want to work on Magnus for 25 years, but, keep an eye on the projects that you worked on.
Magnus was a wreck. Yeah. I also was working on the description of Magnus.
And the other thing I would say is we've talked quite a lot about experience and expertise, and absolutely I don't undermine that. But again, if you go outside the industry and look at some of these studies that have been done on behavioural biases in decision making, there is lots of evidence that the more expert you are, the more hopeless you are in certain aspects of what you do in terms of, what is expected. So I am now an expert. So you are expecting me to give you a rather narrow range, aren't you? And I have a desire to fulfill your aspirations. So absolutely expertise and experience is important, but we need to be a little bit careful that, it's not the solution to every single problem.
No. I mean, you've made a really good point about that uncertainty thing. I used to kind of drive people in the teams that work with me to really embrace uncertainty, almost shutting people away in rooms separately and saying, you will come up with a different interpretation, or so we won't feed you for 2 days, kind of thing. But, because it's very difficult to kind of ignore those inherent biases that are part of your makeup. And then on the other side, talking about you don't just need experience, you want that youthful exuberance and challenge and somebody who's going to get under your nose and get under your skin and threaten your experience. So it has to be a balance. Always has to be a balance.
Well, please. One last one, and then we need to keep moving a little.
In partnership groups, sometimes you find there's friction between the partners within a group on a development project, which can result, I think, sometimes in the operator becoming more macho and gung-ho than he ought to be. Do you think this is a significant problem? I mean, particularly when you have a bigger company as the non-partner and a smaller company as the operator. sorry, a bigger company is a partner and a small company is the operator, they may be more bullish and drive things faster than they should do.
Rolando, do you want to?
Well,
Any evidence that that's so?
we've looked at partnership counts and joint ventures, et cetera, and there's certain practices that drive more successful ones than others. But two thoughts, and one follows up on a question you asked about how, do you see any benefit in some of these metrics with more partnerships? We haven't seen it in a lot of metrics except with production forecasts. The greater the number of partnerships, the more accurate the production forecasts have been, because there's more challenge and more people looking and but we don't necessarily see that with cost and schedule forecasts, but we do see it with the production forecasts. So, but we've also seen some where the most successful ones are where the two partners or the multiple partners agree on a set of rules before they execute the project and a process that's going to be used to execute this project that's not a hybrid, and that they clearly say it's your process and we're just going to live with your process. If that's defined early on, those tend to be the more successful ones. It doesn't necessarily matter whose it is, but they just need to early on agree whose it is. And some have tried to make a hybrid process, and that was no good at all, because then nobody knows exactly what to do.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it all answers all of it, but that's on the sidelines. Those are some of the issues.
And I think in some of the smaller operators, they do find it intimidated by one of the big players being their partners, and it can sometimes drive the wrong behaviours and drive the wrong decisions. Again, it's part of human nature, and there are ways you can mitigate. It's a risk. You mitigate that risk.
I think there's more risk. I mean, I understand the dynamic you talked about, but I think on balance, there's more risk being on your own. Because you asked a question earlier about, I'm on the board, I've got 5 minutes to think about this project, and I would ask two questions. Anna, am I on my own? And when I mean on my own, I don't mean do I have a partner, I mean do I have a partner that is capable of contributing, who has let's say a considered opinion. Am I on my own? Do I have a partner with a considered opinion? And have I and or him done this before? Do I have benchmarks? Do I have norms? Do I have capability? And if the answer to both of those questions is no, I would suggest you should be very worried.
Watch out and buy Tesco.
100%. Absolutely, 100% agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think those are, and we fail to, again in our processes, we somehow fail to discriminate between, here's a project, I've got a 30% interest, I have two major IOCs as partners, and I've done 3 of them before. And here's a project, I'm on my own, I'm moving into unconventionals in a country I've got no presence in with 100% working interest. And somehow those two projects seem to get assimilated the same way, but in reality they're not the same project, are they really?
It's a really, really good point, that.
Okay, very good. Let's stop there. Thanks to the panel for the discussion, and let's give you a round of applause. Thank you for that.